Story is The Moon Book by Gail Gibbons. As the sun sets at the end of each day, the sky becomes darker and darker, and on many clear nights, our moon shines as brightly as possible in the night sky. Our moon is the biggest and brightest light in our night sky. It outshines all of the stars and planets combined, in which it appears as small points of light. Some planets have many moons. Earth has just one. Our moon looks big and bright because it is so close to the Earth compared to the faraway stars and planets. It's about 238,900 miles away, and that's considered close. The moon makes no light of its own to shine. It's bright in the night sky because it reflects the sun's light. It's about 1/4 the size of the Earth, and it is made up of rock and dust. There is no air or sign of life. Most astronomers and other scientists think that the moon formed about 4.5 billion years ago. Some believe something collided with Earth that tossed out a cloud of rock and debris, and while orbiting around the Earth, that rock and debris came together and it formed the moon. So the moon is part Earth. In ancient times, people thought that the moon was a powerful god or goddess. The Romans called the moon their goddess Diana. In Greece, the moon goddess was Selene, who rode through the sky in a silver chariot. And some American Indian tribes believed that the moon and the sun were brother and sister gods. Stories and legends were told about the shapes and shadows that show up on the moon's surface. Some people said that the moon showed a man's face, the man in the moon, who was imprisoned there for stealing. Others told of moon demons that were living there. Ooh. The moon is Earth's only natural satellite, and it takes about 1 month for the moon to travel around the Earth. The moon makes one complete rotation for each complete trip around the Earth, and thus the same side of the moon is always facing Earth. The moon appears to change shape, but it doesn't. The different shapes we see are called the phases of the moon, and we're seeing different amounts of light being reflected onto the moon. How much light we see depends on the position of the Earth, the moon, and the sun. During a new moon, the moon is almost directly between the sun and the Earth, and the moon looks dark, so we can see no reflected light. Now, the moon is waxing when the lit surface begins to get bigger. And in a few days, the sunlight will slide over to the side of the moon, and it will start to look like the crescent moon. Now, when the moon is 1/4 of its way around the Earth, it is in its first quarter phase. And when we see it half lit. And sometimes it is called the half moon. Now, continuing with the phases, the gibbous moon is when the moon is waxing between the first quarter and full moon. This is called the gibbous moon. A full moon. We all know the full moon. This is about 2 weeks have passed since the new moon, and now the entire face of the moon can be seen as it shines, reflecting the sunlight. The moon is waning when its lit surface begins to get smaller. And when the moon is waning between a full moon and a last quarter moon, it is the gibbous moon once again. The last quarter moon is when the moon is 3/4 of the way around Earth, and it is in its last quarter phase. Again, we see it as a half lit, and sometimes we call it the half moon. The crescent moon is once again seen as a small silver lining in the sky as the Earth begins to move in front of the sun again. It takes the new moon about 1 month to go through all of its entire phases. People used to know the time of the month by watching the moon's phase. A solar eclipse, which actually happens once a year or so. Now, this usually happens when it is slightly tilted compared to Earth's orbit around the Sun. And because of this, the Moon cannot exactly line up between the Sun and the Earth. But when the Moon's orbit is not tilted and the Moon lines up exactly between the Moon and the Earth, a solar eclipse happens. That's when the Sun is blocked completely by the Moon. The Moon's shadow falls on Earth, and a solar eclipse can last up to 7 to 8 minutes. Now, when the Sun, the Earth, and the Moon exactly line up, a lunar eclipse can happen. And as a solar eclipse, the Moon's orbit is not tilted. The Earth blocks the sunlight that usually lights up the Moon. And this time, the Moon has a reddish glow. Lunar comes from the word luna, the Latin word for moon. A lunar eclipse can last up to 3.5 hours. Much longer than a solar eclipse. Now, there's lots of things that the Moon affects. Mostly, though, we notice it in the tides. The Moon affects the oceans. It pulls the gravity, and the oceans are strong enough that it can cause the tides. Tides are daily rising and falling of the ocean's water. This is because the Moon takes about 25 hours to come back to the same place in the sky as it was the night before. And the tide can be different in different places on the Earth. Now, some night sky gazers and astronomers can get a close-up view of the Moon by looking through binoculars. Others use telescopes, and some even use observatories, which are giant telescopes. A close-up view of the Moon's surface shows dark patches. Astronomers call the plains or seas. Other areas are covered with craters, mountains, and valleys. The Moon's craters were caused between 3.5 and 4.5 billion years ago, when meteors pounded its surface. And since there's no atmosphere, they just stay there. They don't get washed away. For centuries, people have wanted to know about our Moon. And in 1959, the Soviet spacecraft Luna 3 transmitted to Earth the very first pictures of the far side, or the back of the Moon. And it was the first time anyone had ever seen that side of the Moon. Now, there aren't many dark areas on that side, so we can't see it from Earth unless we send a satellite around it. And then in 1961, President John F. Kennedy made a commitment to put Americans on the Moon before the end of the decade. At first, many American unmanned spacecrafts were sent. Pictures were taken, the Severe one landed on the Moon, and in 1966, it sent back information about the Moon's surface. The first manned orbit of the Moon was made by the Apollo astronauts in 1968. And on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin on the Apollo 11 mission became the first men to walk on the Moon. There were 5 more Apollo landings on the Moon, and the last one, Apollo 17, was in 1972. The astronomers did experiments and gathered samples. Astronomers and other scientists were able to learn more about the history and nature of our Moon from these experiments. And on a clear night, when the Moon is in the sky, you can gaze up at it, and we are still learning more about our closest neighbor,